The glass table was cold under my fingertips. I had pressed my palm flat against it when I stood up to present my quarterly numbers, and the cold shot straight up my arm like a warning I should have taken seriously. 4 investors sat across from me. 2 board members flanked Marcus Webb at the head of the table. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind him framed the city skyline like a painting. My slides still glowed on the screen: revenue figures, growth projections, 3 weeks of my work. I had just finished saying we were up 31%. 31%. Then Marcus placed both hands flat on the table. He didn't look at the investors. He didn't look at the board members. He looked directly at me with the calm, rehearsed expression of a man who had already decided what was going to happen before the meeting started. "Sonia." He said my name like it tasted off. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties." The room went completely still. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop. He looked at the investors, then back at me. "You've become emotional." My throat closed. A nervous laugh flickered somewhere around the table. No one defended me. My badge was already in his hand. That's when I realized this wasn't spontaneous. This was staged. And everyone in that room already knew. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, because people always assume that when a woman gets blindsided in a room full of powerful men, she falls apart. I didn't fall apart. Not there. I looked around the table slowly. 2 investors stared at their phones. 1 board member studied the ceiling. The other picked up his coffee cup. Nobody pushed back. Nobody questioned it. Nobody made eye contact with me. 7 years. 7 years of 6-day work weeks, vendor negotiations, and operational systems built from scratch, and in the time it took Marcus to say 1 sentence, all of it was gone. My throat was tight, but my hands stayed steady. I reached down and picked up my leather notebook. The dark brown one I had carried since my 2nd year at the company. Every page was full of vendor contacts, margin notes, supplier terms, and shorthand only I could read. Nobody stopped me from taking it. Marcus leaned back in his chair like he had just finished a mildly interesting task. "Security will escort you out," he said. And that was when it clicked. This wasn't a reaction to something I had done wrong. The badge in his hand, the security team waiting outside, the practiced calm, it had all been arranged. Every detail planned. This was a performance. And I was the sacrifice. My name is Sonia Whitmore. 7 years earlier, Marcus Webb hired me to run operations for a company called Vantage Group. At the time, Vantage had 12 employees, folding chairs instead of furniture, and a stack of unpaid vendor invoices in the corner. Marcus was the idea man. The pitch man. He could walk into any room and make people believe they were watching the beginning of something great. He had the handshake of a promise and the kind of confidence that other people mistake for competence. But behind the pitch decks and bold projections, there was nothing holding the company together. That was my job. I built the vendor network from scratch. I called suppliers personally, negotiated terms, and built relationships over months and years. I designed the regional partnership structure. I created the operational systems that turned a chaotic startup into a company that could actually scale. Marcus stood at the front of the room and sold the vision. I stood in the back and made sure the vision had a foundation to stand on. Infrastructure doesn't get applause. It doesn't get headlines or toasts at the company dinner. It just holds everything up quietly, day after day, until someone decides it is no longer needed. And then it walks out the front door. The elevator ride down was the longest of my life. A security guard named Phil stood next to me. Phil had been with Vantage for 4 years. I had approved his holiday schedule 3 times. He stared straight ahead at the elevator doors and said nothing, which was its own kind of kindness. I stared at my reflection in the polished metal. My face looked the same as always. Same steady expression I had trained myself to wear in hard meetings. But something behind my eyes had shifted, like a clock still ticking but moved to a different room. When the elevator opened in the lobby, I stopped. I turned and looked back up through the glass walls. I could see the boardroom on the 7th floor. Marcus was already on his feet again, gesturing with both hands. The investors had leaned in. Someone was laughing. He hadn't even waited for the elevator doors to close. I watched him for exactly 3 seconds. And I noticed something that I tucked away carefully, like a document filed in the back of a drawer because you know you'll need it later. He wasn't angry. He was relieved. That expression, the loosened shoulders, the easy smile, told me something more important than anything he had said upstairs. He hadn't fired me because I failed. He fired me because I knew too much. I drove home without music. I sat in my apartment for a long time, looking out the window at the street below. People were walking dogs. A delivery truck double-parked outside the coffee shop across the road. Everything outside looked completely normal, which felt strange, because nothing inside felt normal at all. I didn't call anyone that night. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table. And I did the one thing I always do when something breaks. I started to think clearly. Not about revenge. About facts. I opened my laptop and pulled up every file I had saved on my personal hard drive. Contracts. Supplier agreements. Expansion models. Email chains with vendor partners going back 5 years. Documents I had backed up over the years not because I was planning anything, but because I had always been a careful person. I read through them slowly. Marcus had just announced a $200 million acquisition. Bold. Aggressive. The kind of headline deal that gets a CEO's name in the business press. But the deal was over-leveraged. It depended on supply chain stability, consistent vendor relationships, reliable logistics, and steady operational performance. All of which I had personally built and maintained. All of which were now connected to me. Not to Marcus. To me. I closed my laptop and sat quietly for a moment. Then I said, softly, to no one, "That's interesting." 3 days after I left the building for the last time, my phone rang. It was a number I recognized. A logistics partner I had worked with for 4 years, a man named Thomas Okafor who ran one of our largest supply vendors. We had negotiated 2 major contracts together. Sonia. His voice was careful. I heard you left Vantage. Should we be concerned? That word, concerned, told me everything. Thomas wasn't calling to express sympathy. He was calling because he was uncertain about the future of his company's relationship with Vantage. And his first instinct, when that uncertainty hit, had been to call me. Not Marcus. Me. I kept my voice steady and warm. I told him the transition was smooth. I told him everything was fine. I didn't tell him what I was really thinking, that his phone call had just confirmed the single most important thing I needed to know. The vendor relationships holding Vantage together were loyalty-based. And the loyalty wasn't to the company. Over the next 2 days, 3 more calls came in. Each one started the same way. We heard you left. Should we be concerned? I answered each call carefully. Neutrally. I didn't reassure anyone. I just listened. And in the silence between what people said and what they didn't say, I began to understand exactly how wide the cracks in Marcus's plan really were. 2 weeks after my firing, I saw the press release. Marcus had issued a public statement about the acquisition. Polished. Full of confident language about strategic growth and market leadership. His photo. His quote. His handshake with the chairman. I read it twice. Then I pulled up my own financial models, the ones I had built over 2 years mapping Vantage's operational risk areas. Marcus had never fully read them. Numbers bored him. Strategy documents bored him. What he liked was the summary slide and the big green arrows pointing up. I ran the acquisition through my models. The deal structure was aggressive in a way that made my stomach tighten. It assumed supply-side stability at current contract rates. It assumed continued vendor cooperation through the transition period. It assumed the operational backbone would hold while absorbing a new company. Without the vendor relationships I had spent years building, that backbone would weaken quickly. Without someone managing the supplier terms personally, renegotiations would stall. Costs would rise. Timelines would slip. The acquisition was built on a foundation that had just walked out the door in a navy blazer with a leather notebook under her arm. Marcus had fired the person holding the whole thing together. And he had done it 2 weeks before the most complicated deal of his career. That night, I sat down with my laptop and a yellow notepad and I did something I hadn't done in years. I assessed the situation completely without emotion. No bitterness. No anger. Just numbers and facts and a clean, clear-eyed look at what was real. I went through every document I had saved. Every vendor contract. Every supplier note. Every email thread where I had personally smoothed a pricing dispute or renegotiated terms. Every risk assessment. Every operational framework I had designed from scratch. I made a list. By the time I finished, the list covered 3 pages. The picture was stark. Vantage Group's ability to execute the $200 million acquisition depended on operational stability. Operational stability depended on vendor trust. Vendor trust depended on relationships. And those relationships, every single one of them, ran through me. Marcus thought he had fired a department head. He had actually removed the load-bearing wall. I closed my notepad and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. I wasn't plotting anything yet. I was just looking at the truth the way you look at a chessboard and take stock of where every piece actually stands. And what I saw on that board was something I had not expected to find. A real opening. Not for revenge. For something much more powerful than revenge. Leverage. The call I had been hoping for came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the firing. His name was Patrick Adeyemi. He had been a mentor to me early in my career, a sharp, patient man who ran a mid-sized private equity firm and had a reputation for buying companies that other people had undervalued. I heard what happened, Patrick said. No small talk. No preamble. I'm fine, I said. Exploring options. What kind of options? I paused. Not because I didn't know the answer, because I had rehearsed the pause. Long enough to signal I was thinking seriously. Short enough to show I wasn't uncertain. I'm not looking for employment, I said. I'm looking at something more structural. Quiet on the other end. Would you ever consider owning instead of operating? He asked. 4 words. But I felt the ground shift under me as he said them, the way it does when a door you assumed was locked turns out to be wide open. I had spent 7 years building someone else's company. Negotiating contracts in someone else's name. Expanding into markets for someone else's profit. Building systems that ran on my expertise but carried someone else's logo. Patrick was asking if I was ready to change that. I looked at the yellow notepad on my table. 3 pages of leverage. Tell me more, I said. Patrick and I met for coffee 2 days later. He had already been watching Vantage from a distance. The $200 million acquisition had caught the attention of several investors in his network. A deal that size always drew eyes. What he hadn't known was the operational picture underneath the headlines. I laid it out clearly. The vendor dependencies. The supplier relationships. The risk architecture of the acquisition. The fact that the person who had built and maintained all of it had been fired 2 weeks before the deal was supposed to close. I didn't editorialize. No bitterness. Just facts, presented the way I would have in any boardroom, calm, supported by data, and completely devastating in what they implied. Patrick listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet. He stirred his coffee and looked at the table. Then he looked up at me. If the acquisition wobbles, he said, and the valuation drops, is there a realistic path to a rescue offer? I had already run those numbers. Yes, I said. But the offer would need to include one condition above everything else. New leadership, Patrick said. He hadn't needed to ask. We both already knew. The next month was the quietest I had lived in years. On the outside, I was simply a recently fired executive taking time to consider her next steps. I went for long walks in the morning. I cooked meals I had never had time for before. I called my sister in Toronto twice a week. On the inside, I was watching. Patrick had people who tracked Vantage's financial signals, supplier payment delays, contract renegotiation flags, investor communication patterns. He shared updates twice a week. I read them carefully. The picture was developing exactly as I had expected, but faster. Thomas Okafor's logistics company had quietly paused a scheduled contract renewal. 2 smaller suppliers had requested revised payment terms. One regional partner had declined to extend their agreement pending clarity on leadership direction. None of these were catastrophes by themselves. But together, they were the sound of a foundation shifting. The people inside Vantage couldn't hear it yet. They were too busy with acquisition paperwork, too convinced that operational momentum was something you could inherit simply by taking over someone's chair. Marcus was still giving interviews. Still confident. Still smiling. I read one interview where he described himself as a visionary 3 times in 4 paragraphs. I put the magazine down and went back to my numbers. 6 weeks after my firing, the first public crack appeared. A line in a financial trade publication, the Vantage acquisition timeline had slipped by approximately 3 weeks. Marcus's team called it a standard adjustment in complex deal processes. 3 days later, another slip. 1 more week added to the timeline. Then a supplier whose contract renewal I had personally negotiated the previous year quietly declined to proceed under the new management. They didn't make noise. They just didn't sign. Patrick called the morning that news filtered through. The board is starting to ask questions, he said. What kind? The kind that don't have comfortable answers. Missed projections. Vendor hesitation. Capital line stress. They're requesting independent operational reports. I thought about the board members who had sat silently while Marcus fired me. The ones who had studied their coffee cups and looked at the ceiling. Who's writing the reports? I asked. New ops head Marcus appointed. A man named Kevin Briggs. 6 months out of business school. I closed my eyes for a moment. How long before they figure out he doesn't know what he's doing? They already know, Patrick said. That's why they're requesting the reports. The cracks were widening. Right on schedule. Marcus called me on a Thursday afternoon, 8 weeks after the firing. First contact since the day he handed my badge to security and turned back to the room like I was already gone. His name appeared on my screen. I sat still for a moment, just looking at it. Then I answered. Sonia. His voice was different. The smooth confidence was still there, but underneath it, something had tightened. I've been thinking. There might be value in a consulting arrangement while we work through the transition. Consulting. He wanted me to fix the problems I had predicted would happen, under a contract he controlled, for a fraction of what he had paid me before. The expertise without the threat. The function without the title. I don't think that works for me right now, I said. A pause. Long enough to tell me he hadn't expected that answer. The offer is generous, he said carefully. I'm sure it is. But I have other things I'm focusing on. Another pause. Shorter. More pressured. Is there anything that would change your mind? Not right now, Marcus, I said. And I ended the call. I sat quietly for a long moment afterward. He was sweating. Not where anyone could see. But he was sweating. And that told me we were exactly on schedule. The quarterly earnings report came out in the 10th week. I read it the same morning it was released, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while I worked through the numbers. Earnings had underperformed by 14% against projections. Not catastrophic on its own. But combined with the vendor hesitations, the timeline slips, and the capital line stress, it created a picture that investors read very clearly. The acquisition was visibly wobbling. By mid-morning, Vantage's private valuation estimates had dropped by 11%. By end of day, they had dropped further. Patrick called at 4 o'clock. Investors are spooked, he said. Not panicking yet. But spooked. How spooked? 3 of them have quietly asked about operational stability. 2 of those 3 were in the boardroom when Marcus fired you. I let that sit for a moment. Are they asking about me specifically? 1 mentioned your name, Patrick said. Asked how things might look different if the leadership question had been handled differently. I didn't say anything. Sonia, Patrick said. I think it's time to start drafting the proposal. The valuation had dropped 28% by end of month. That was our window. And we moved. Patrick's team spent 2 weeks building the acquisition rescue proposal. I was involved in every detail. The structure was clean: stabilization capital to shore up the balance sheet, debt restructuring to relieve pressure on the acquisition financing, and a full operational overhaul to restore vendor trust and renegotiate the supplier contracts that had stalled. It was a real plan. Not a hostile takeover dressed in polite language. Vantage was worth saving, the core business was solid, the market position was strong, and the vendor network I had built, though weakened, wasn't destroyed yet. What the company needed wasn't demolition. It needed competent leadership. The proposal had one central condition, written clearly in the term sheet. Complete leadership restructuring, effective upon close of deal. Marcus would receive a fair exit package. No vindictiveness. No punitive terms. Just a clean, well-compensated departure. We submitted the proposal on a Friday afternoon through Patrick's formal channels. It arrived in the inbox of Vantage's general counsel at 4:15, just before the weekend. I sat in my apartment that evening and tried to read a novel. I couldn't concentrate on a single page. Not because I was nervous, but because the most important move I had ever made was now sitting in someone else's inbox, and all I could do was wait. The weekend was very quiet. Nothing Saturday. Nothing Sunday. Monday morning, Patrick called at 8. The board has called an emergency session. They've been in the room since 7. Is Marcus in there? He was for the first hour. He's been removed from the session. He's currently waiting in a conference room down the hall. I thought about that image. Marcus Webb sitting alone while the board discussed his future without him. I had sat in enough of those rooms over the years to know exactly how that silence feels, the kind that has weight to it, that presses down on your shoulders. What's the mood? I asked. Serious. They've seen the valuation drop. They've seen the vendor reports. And they've seen our proposal, which is more credible than anything their current team has produced. Are they going to take it? Patrick paused. There's one thing they keep coming back to. The leadership replacement clause. They're asking who the new executive would be. And? I told them, Patrick said. There was a long silence in the room. Then the chairman asked if you would be willing to take a call. I set down my coffee cup. Yes, I said. I'll take the call. The call with board chairman Arthur Weston lasted 40 minutes. He was direct. Formal. A man who didn't waste words, which I respected immediately. He asked me 3 questions. The first, were the vendor relationships recoverable? I told him yes, with the right approach and enough time. 6 months if we moved quickly. I named specific suppliers and specific steps. The second, was the acquisition itself salvageable? I told him it depended entirely on stabilizing the operational foundation first. Rush the deal in its current state and it would collapse. Rebuild properly and the acquisition could close successfully 12 months from now. The third question was the one that mattered most. Are you willing to come back? Arthur asked. I had thought about this for 3 months. Turned it over in quiet moments and in long sleepless patches at 2 in the morning. And I had come to a clear answer that had nothing to do with satisfaction. I'm willing to lead the restructured company, I said. Not as an employee. As majority stakeholder and acting CEO, under the terms of the acquisition proposal. A pause. Understood, Arthur said. One more thing, I said. I won't advise under any arrangement where Marcus remains in a leadership role. Also understood, Arthur said. He thanked me and ended the call. The board met again 2 days later. Patrick was in the room representing our group. I was not. I sat in my apartment working through vendor contact lists, preparing for the calls I would need to make the moment the vote came through. Patrick texted me at 11:47 in the morning. 2 words, vote unanimous. I read the text twice. Then I put my phone face down and sat very still for almost a full minute. I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. What I felt wasn't triumph. It was something quieter and steadier, the feeling you get when a long, difficult calculation finally resolves to the number you knew it would. Relief wrapped inside a deep, bone-level satisfaction. The acquisition rescue proposal had been approved. The leadership restructuring clause had been enacted. Effective upon close of deal, Marcus Webb was removed as CEO of Vantage Group. Effective upon close of deal, I was majority stakeholder and acting chief executive. Patrick called 30 seconds after the text. How do you feel? He asked. Focused, I said. I need to call Thomas Okafor this afternoon. Patrick laughed, a short, warm sound. That's the Sonia I know. Straight to work. We have a company to stabilize, I said. Let's not waste time. There was one more thing before I walked back into that building. The formal closing meeting. Patrick's firm had arranged it for a Thursday. The full board would be present. The acquisition documents would be signed. The leadership transition officially recorded. Marcus would be there for the handover. I spent the night before thinking about what that moment would feel like. Whether I would feel anger when I saw him. Whether I would need to say something. I decided I wouldn't. Not because I had forgiven everything, I hadn't, not fully. But because the meeting wasn't about him anymore. It was about the company and the 530 people who worked there, most of whom had nothing to do with what happened in that boardroom 5 months ago. I put on the same navy blazer I had been wearing the day I was escorted out. Not as a statement. Just because it fit well. I drove to the building. I parked in the visitor section, the same spot I had used when this was still just a possibility I was testing. I sat in the car for 1 minute. Breathed slowly. Looked up at the glass walls. Then I got out, picked up my briefcase, and walked through the front door. The boardroom looked the same. Same glass walls. Same long table. Same floor-to-ceiling windows with the city skyline behind them. The investors were seated. The board members were in their places. Patrick sat to my right, his legal team beside him. Marcus was at the far end of the table. I walked in and the air in the room shifted the way it does when something important is happening and everyone feels it at once. I didn't look at Marcus immediately. I greeted Arthur Weston, shook hands with Patrick, nodded to the board members I recognized. Then I sat down. Only then did I look at Marcus. He looked like a man who had not slept properly in 3 weeks. The tailored suit was still there. The jaw was still sharp. But the ease was gone, the loose, unhurried confidence that had always been his most reliable tool. He sat with his shoulders pulled slightly inward, both hands flat on the table, watching me with an expression I hadn't expected. He looked uncertain. Not angry. Not indignant. Just uncertain. And I realized, sitting across from him in the same room where he had fired me 5 months ago, that the smirk I had seen as I walked out, the relief, the satisfaction, was completely and utterly gone. I took out my portfolio and opened it. "Shall we begin?" I said. The signing took 2 hours. Document after document. Legal teams reviewing. Board members confirming. Patrick's team working through each condition in a way that left no room for ambiguity. Halfway through, I watched something happen to Marcus. He started to understand. Not the broad strokes, he had known the broad strokes for weeks. But the specific details. Reading a proposal is different from sitting in a room while it is executed line by line. The investors backing the rescue deal were Patrick's network, people connected to me, people who had trusted my read of the situation. The restructuring plan at the center of the proposal was the one I had drafted from 7 years of knowledge built inside this company. The leadership replacement clause, being enacted right now, in this room, in real time, had been written with one person in mind. I watched the moment he connected all of it. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved from the documents to Patrick, then to me. A long look. Not hostile. Just finally, fully comprehending. He had thought the pieces on the board were his. He had not realized, until this moment, that the board itself belonged to someone else. Arthur Weston called for the formal vote at 2:15. I had expected it to be close. I expected at least one board member to request an additional review period, or push back on the timeline, or raise concerns about the transition speed. I was wrong. The vote was unanimous. Every board member approved. Arthur announced the result and moved immediately to the next item, formal transition of executive authority. Marcus's exit had been arranged carefully by Patrick's legal team. Clean. Professional. Fair compensation. A non-disparagement agreement in both directions. No public statements beyond a brief announcement about a planned leadership transition. He would not be escorted out by security. He would not be told in front of investors that he had become emotional. He would be thanked for his contributions, handed his exit package, and shown to the door. Because that was the right way to do it. Not because it was easy. Because it was right. I had not come back to humiliate him. I had come back to fix what he had broken. And that required the kind of steadiness that revenge never allows for. I had decided, a long time before this moment, that I would not let what he did to me make me into something I didn't want to be. Marcus packed his office the following morning under supervision. I had already started work by the time he arrived. My desk was covered in printouts. Vendor contact lists. Supplier risk assessments. Notes from 3 calls I had already made that morning, including a 30-minute conversation with Thomas Okafor that had gone better than I had hoped. I didn't go to watch Marcus pack. I sent Arthur Weston to handle it. Professional. Appropriate. But late in the afternoon, I walked past the glass-walled office on my way to a meeting and I saw him. He was placing a framed photo into a cardboard box. Head down. Movement slow. The box was still mostly empty, the kind of packing that keeps stopping because the person doing it can't quite believe they're doing it. He looked up and saw me through the glass. We looked at each other for a moment. I thought about everything I could have said. 7 years of it. The early mornings. The weekends. The vendor calls at 9 at night. The day he had stood in front of investors and said the word emotional, and the room had gone quiet, and not one person had spoken up. I didn't say any of it. I nodded once. A simple, professional acknowledgement. Then I continued down the hallway to my meeting. There was a great deal of work to do. The first week was the most intense work of my life. I spent the first 3 days on vendor calls. 14 conversations in 72 hours. I was direct with every supplier and partner. I acknowledged the uncertainty of the past 2 months and asked for the chance to rebuild what had been damaged. 11 of the 14 agreed immediately. 2 asked for additional meetings, which I scheduled for the following week. 1 walked away, which I had expected. Some trust, once broken, needs more time than I could give. By the end of the first week, the operational picture had already begun to stabilize. The acquisition timeline, which Marcus had let drift by nearly 6 weeks, was being rebuilt on a more realistic and solid schedule. The board noticed. Arthur Weston sent me a brief message after the first weekly report, exactly what we needed to see. Patrick called at the end of the week. "How does it feel?" he asked. "It feels like work," I said. "Which is exactly how it should feel." He laughed. "2 of the investors mentioned your name specifically. Said it was the right call." I thought about those same investors sitting silent in the boardroom 5 months ago. "Better late than never," I said simply. And I meant it without bitterness. 5 months after Marcus Webb relieved me of my duties in front of a room full of people who said nothing, I walked into the Vantage Group building as majority stakeholder and acting CEO. Not escorted. Not dismissed. Just walking in. The company grew 40% in the year that followed. The acquisition closed safely 9 months after I took over, on terms better than what Marcus had originally negotiated. The vendor network was stronger than at any point in the company's history. Marcus faded quietly into vague consulting work. No drama. No final confrontation. No last words. He just gradually became less relevant, the way people do when the thing they build turns out to have never truly belonged to them. I kept the leather notebook. The dark brown one with vendor contacts and margin notes in blue ink. Not as a reminder of what happened. As a reminder of what I had always known. The person who builds the foundation is not the same as the person who puts their name on the building. When the building starts to crack, people don't call the name on the door. They call the person who laid the bricks. I never needed his permission to rise. I just needed him to get out of the way. Real power doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly and acts with precision when the moment arrives. The greatest revenge isn't taking someone down. It's proving you never needed them to succeed. Please like, share, and subscribe for more intriguing stories. The end.